Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is CPDP's opening night. It's traditionally a more relaxed enterprise because people are coming to Brussels, are flying in, are finding their hotels, and are worried about checking in and being there tomorrow on time at 8 a.m. we start, like every year. So you will all be there tomorrow morning at 8. But so the opening night is also where the format is not controlled by CPDP, and where we allow panels to go to find their own tempo and and to present ideas in a different way. And so this evening is organized by the Brussels Privacy Hub, NIM Technologies, Privacy Salon, and Brave. And CPDP is not amongst the organizers, but we welcome the co-organizers. We're very happy with them having found a way to us, and we hope for more collaborations in the future. It is a packed opening night. We have 2 hours, and we have 2 sessions, one on cloud money and one on vulnerability. There are 2 moderators that each moderator will present her or his own panel. Just about this opening night, what I can say from CPDP, well-chosen themes. I like the idea of money. It's when will privacy reach the common person? Like the common person is not us because we're fascinated by privacy. But I think the money theme is maybe a candidate. People understand what happens with their money. We don't understand what happens with our privacy, but we do understand what happens with our money. So I like that theme a lot, and I hope for some bridging between those that are totally in favor of digital currencies and those that are totally against digital money and want to work and keep on working with traditional coins. I hope both can one day find each other, because I think they have the same concerns. Democracy is one of them. Privacy is, of course, another one. So it's a golden privacy theme for me, and it should have been at CPDP, and I'm happy it is there now. And then we go to a new theme. It's not new. Vulnerability is not new. It's as old as mankind, as humankind. But it's important to bring it at a privacy conference, because the whole GDPR and the whole privacy reasoning is based on the reasonable, educated, older person, often a man. But now, what about the rest of mankind and humankind? And so I'm very happy with both themes. And by having said that, I want to give the floor to Jaya, who's going to introduce her panel. Thank you, Jaya, for doing that and being here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction. That was a wonderful introduction. Yes, thank you. And thanks to the audience that has shown up on this beautiful sunny day. So yeah, we proposed this panel about 6 months ago when there was a lot of discussion of the digital euro, kind of in anticipation that this would potentially be a major theme of the CPDP this year. It isn't quite that theme, and I think we have a little bit of a history at NIM of proposing themes that are kind of maybe a bit early or too late, but it's not quite clear. Last year, NIM Technologies also did an opening panel which was focused on client-side scanning. And what we've seen over the past year is, in fact, client-side scanning has become quite an issue with the online security bill in the UK and also bills in Europe. So I'm hoping that something similar might happen with the topic of CBDCs, digital money. And I think we have the right people up here on the panel today to really dig into what's at stake. So the title of the panel is Cloud Money, Data Privacy and Sovereignty, and what is at stake in this big shift. So what we're seeing, and I think a lot of people in the audience will know this, and as Paul mentioned, money is something that everybody touches on a daily basis, but what we touch is changing form, right? It's changing mediums from something that is physical cash into digital forms, and taking a variety of digital forms. And when something changes forms, quite fundamental things actually start to shift. The people that provide for those particular forms shift, but also the medium themselves start to have externalities, right? And when we're talking about the digital world, those externalities usually come in the form of data, right? And that usually comes with a variety of issues, including definitely privacy. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And on the panel with me, I've got Brett Scott, who's the author of Cloud Money, the book. And I stole that title, which is a fantastic title. But the full title of Brett's book is Cloud Money, Cash, Cards, and Crypto, right? The War for Our Wallets. So great title. And then we've also got Andrés Arauz, who was the previous director of the Central Bank of Ecuador, has done a lot of research into the data of money. So he's going to be talking a little bit about that, but was actually also probably one of the first people in the world to run experiments with what we now call central bank digital currencies. So we're going to get into that a little bit as well. And with me, we also have Alfredo Real, who's part of the research team at NIM Technologies. And is replacing Anya Piotrowska, who heads the research team. Alfredo has very kindly stepped in. Co-author of a paper on eCash. So how can we really merge the best of both worlds instead of getting the worst of digital money? So Alfredo is going to be talking a little bit about the possibilities, the technical possibilities around eCash and a technical analysis of the digital euro. I myself, I'm Jaya Clara Brecki, and I'm head of strategy at NIM Technologies. And NIM is a privacy startup. We're based out of Switzerland. And we are building, amongst other things, something called a mixnet, but also working on quite sophisticated cryptographic technologies around anonymous credentials, a lot of the cryptography of which Alfredo is responsible for, and a lot of which is also the core building blocks of the possibility of having eCash, basically, privacy-preserving anonymous payments, even though it's in digital form. So fantastic panel. And I think I'll start with Brett, actually, because Brett usually gives a fantastic overview of what's really at stake when we're talking about this transition from the physical form of cash to the new digital forms that we're seeing in kind of card payments and CBDCs and so on. So, Brett, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Sure.
Big picture.
I'll do my best. It's interesting that right now, when people are in a lot of the current debates about so-called cashless society, everyone's focusing on CBDC, the sort of new hypothetical state-issued digital currency. But historically, the debate around cashless society is very different. Historically, cashless society is actually a euphemism used to refer to the situation where private sector banks take over the monetary system, all right? Because in our current systems, private sector banks control the digital systems. And immediately you can tell there's quite a different politics to that when you say to people, a cashless society sounds like, you're sort of getting rid of something, or you talk about the absence of something. But when you ask what's present in a cashless society, well, it's big tech and big finance, really. And that immediately gives you a different sense of the politics of what's at stake. And also, when you really zoom out and you look at big meta processes and capitalist economies, and you ask yourself, why is this actually happening? Well, for hundreds of years, big companies have tried to automate things, right? And right now, when you're looking at the monetary system, it's one of the new waves of automation, right? So the cash system essentially stands in the way of corporate automation. A lot of these players, for example, Uber and Amazon, etc., they hate cash, all right, de facto. They can't automate it, all right? So at a structural level, the global economy has these tensions in it where non-automated, non-digital things are getting slowly shafted out precisely because they stand in the way of scaling and making things faster and, more automated. And that's what's really going on. But many ordinary people actually don't resonate with that vision. Many ordinary people do actually want to keep physical cash. But in many mainstream circles, this is just not appreciated, or people don't feel they can act upon it. One of the most frustrating elements of the debate around cashless society is that digital money is presented as some kind of upgrade to cash, right? So it's a little bit like people think of cash as being like the horse cart of payments. And then they say, well, I guess digital money is like the car, and it's going to be this natural transition where we move from one to the other. But this is an incredibly dubious vision for multiple reasons. And one of the best metaphors to kind of help you break out of that way of thinking about cash is to realize that the global or any monetary system is made up of multiple different players and who issue multiple different types of money in multiple different forms. And the metaphor to use to grasp this is to think about casinos. All right, I don't know how many of you guys go to casinos, but if you go to a casino and you take 100 euros and you hand it over to a casino, that casino issues you chips. All right, those chips are a secondary form of money, privately issued, that can be used within the confines of the casino. And the only reason those chips have power is that you believe they can be redeemed back for the primary form of money. All right? Now, actually, our whole monetary system works like this with multiple layers of money. If you go to a bank and you hand it over cash, you'd be handing over a primary form of money, and what you get back issued out to you is a secondary, privately issued form of money. And you might want to think about that as being like a digital casino chip. All right? And what's referred to as a cashless society is really a situation where you become totally dependent upon these second-layer digital casino chips issued out by private banks. All right? There's also a third layer built on top of that about the likes of PayPal and so on. And so this is where you start to see the politics of our current monetary system when you think about these different layers that are going on. And one of the big debates that's going on, one of the reasons why we're having this debate around central bank digital currency, or one of the big reasons, is that there's a massive financial stability problem when you undermine the first layer, all right? And in our current society, the first layer is the cash system. It's the only form of state-issued money we can hold. But public confidence in those second-tier systems, those digital chips, as it were, is predicated upon the public believing they can get access to cash. But if access to cash is being undermined, suddenly those digital chips start to seem a lot less secure, which is precisely why there's a debate right now about the so-called digital euro, because during the pandemic, there was a massive drop in cash usage. The last thing I'll say, though, is that the drop in cash usage often is presented as being the sort of organic kind of process that the public has just sort of naturally moved towards. But a lot of what my book is doing, my work, is looking at all the top-down processes whereby large players have actively undermined the cash system for many, many decades. All right? So there's a lot of top-down pushes against the cash system, which eventually manifests in our society as a reduced access to cash and a slow cultural shift to these digital systems. I can maybe tail it off there, or maybe can I do one last little thing? I'm going to quickly just to finish off to maybe illustrate what's at stake from a sort of the ordinary person's perspective. Is I talked about that digital casino chip metaphor. That's one useful thing to think about. But it's often useful to think about cash as being like the public bicycle system of payments, all right? And the digital systems being like the private Uber of payments, right? And it may be that those sort of Uber-fied payments have a certain convenience to them, but the real politics is to imagine, in our transport metaphor, imagine if companies like Uber controlled the entire transport system. All right? Imagine if there was no balance of power between companies like Uber and the public bicycle system. All right? And that's where you start to see the politics. You'd see mass surveillance, you'd see huge censorship problems, you see massive resilience problems in the system, massive exclusion problems, and huge centralization of power, essentially. So the debate around cash and protecting cash is really about protecting a balance of power in the monetary system, not only between different issues, but between different forms of money. And I'll close it off there.
Great, thanks very much, Brett. So fundamentally, a radical shift in power from public infrastructure, in a sense, so money as a public infrastructure, towards a very hyper-privatized form of infrastructure at the core of society that, in fact, has a lot of risks attached to it, inequality being one of them, but also, like you said, censorship and potential privacy issues, which is interesting because normally people think about, when we're talking about CBDCs, that's where people start freaking out about the privacy issues. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But to get a little bit into the question of data specifically, I would love to hear from Andres to give a little bit of the overview of what is the data of money really, and what changes about the data of money when you move from cash to digital payments and CBDCs.
Well, thank you, Jai, for the invitation. It's good to be here. So when you move to electronic transactions, so non-cash transactions with the private banking system, that information which corresponds to the transaction has to flow through several actors, right? So from the terminal, from the point of sale, you know, to the payment providers, the telecommunication provider, and of course, where the transaction is eventually settled, so where the accounting happens, is in the balance sheet of, you know, predominantly a bank somewhere. Now, if that transaction involved at least a different bank, you know, so if you have your money in your bank and I have it in a different bank, we're going to need a third bank to settle the transaction between your account and my account. So we now have 3 banks involved. So that means 3 institutions now have access to that information. But then every step of the way, too, you know, you have these intermediaries, these payment processors that also get a copy of the transaction. And eventually, most of that is stored in the cloud, which is, of course, non-existent. But the actual cloud is a series of data centers that are strategically placed around the world, but overwhelmingly concentrated in the global north, right? So part of my research analyzes where the credit card companies' data centers are and how they get to keep a copy of a regular, you know, debit card transaction of someone in Peru, making a local payment, you know, buying, you know, some milk in the street shop. But, you know, the Visa or MasterCard data centers get a copy of that. And then, because of this geographic distribution of power, because of the concentration of data, that's an issue that's well known in this space, you get sovereignty considerations as well. Because, for example, because those data centers are in the United States, because of the USA Patriot Act, the US government has access of that data. You know, they can subpoena, they can make requests, and they can have access to transactions about foreign citizens in foreign countries, about foreign goods and services, but that were paid with payment processors that have the data centers in the United States. This, for example, happened in a famous case in Canada already almost 20 years ago, when in Canada it was already legal to purchase marijuana, but it wasn't in the United States. So there was a big controversy as to information that the US government had about Canadian citizens that were purchasing marijuana, but being processed through the payment processors that have their data stored in the United States. So this, of course, has even broader implications, because not only can the requests of information be made sort of in the conventional sense of a subpoena or a court order or stuff like that, but we have the intelligence agencies that have basically, you know, backdoors or unauthorized access via hacking methods and so on, of the data, not just of their own country, of their own citizens, but basically of the entire planet, whoever uses a card or makes a digital payment. Now, countries have slowly caught up to this, especially in the Global South, larger countries of the Global South, and have started issuing data localization laws, specifically oriented to domestic payments. And of course, domestic payments are several orders of magnitude, you know, 10,000 times more in number of transactions than cross-border payments, right? But however, these, they are done with foreign payment processors and payment providers and credit card providers and so on, will end up being stored elsewhere. So where is all this data about our transactions? Do we have individual sovereignty over this data? Is there a government nationwide sovereignty over this data? These are still some questions that have to be asked, and a lot of work to do going forward.
Super. So again, to summarize, shift in digital or shift from physical to digital actually implies a lot of data that is produced, which also implies a lot of new intermediaries that have access to that data, and those intermediaries are primarily based in the global north, which brings up issues around sovereignty, both at the individual level and for nations of the global south, and of course, implications for democracy, which I would love for you to also, maybe you could get into that a little bit before we move on to Alfredo.
Sure. You know, if you have your consumption pattern, your geolocalization, which is ingrained in the payment as well, if you have these data points that can identify you based on your where you use your card and when and how much and what stuff you're purchasing, and ever-growing list of requirements that payment processors have in terms of the detail of the transaction, where is your privacy? And if we're talking about a society that needs safe spaces for engaging in what may be in one point of history even illegal, but in another point of history not illegal, for example, the purchase of marijuana, for example, organizing in protests for civil rights of people that have been excluded and so on. These were all things that were illegal in the past, and if they had all that information in terms of, you know, the oppressive governments that would have access to that kind of information, it is very unlikely that those democratic movements would have sprawled successfully, because it's so much easier to oppress and to repress if all that information is readily available via both, you know, conventional means such as court orders, or you know, massive access of information with backdoors and sort of big data analytics that now most governments have available. So there are serious implications in terms of democracy, organization, social movements, construction of alternative futures. If our collective capacity to organize is curtailed by basically mass surveillance through the payment systems.
So, Alfredo, to zoom in a little bit, we've got the kind of big picture of what's at stake in this transition from, cash to digital payments. Is it possible to have something like the best of both worlds, or something like, let's say, digital money without data?
Yes, definitely. So this has been a very active area of research, and cryptographers have developed protocols that actually allow you to have digital cash that offers the same properties in regards to privacy and anonymity as physical cash. So I'm actually going to describe a bit the concept of anonymous e-cash. Basically, in anonymous e-cash, what you have is that users can withdraw e-coins from a bank and then show those e-coins as a payment to a service provider, a vendor of whatever item, etc. And later on, those e-coins will be deposited again with the bank to retrieve what you have sold, to retrieve the amount of money that was being paid, right? So in a very simple design, you could imagine digital cash as based on a signature scheme, the same kind of signature scheme you'd use to sign documents. So for example, you have a document, you sign it with your secret key, and the rest of us could verify that you have signed that document with your public key, right? So we can use a signature scheme to implement anonymous e-cash. In a very simple design, what would happen is that a bank wants to issue you some money as a user, so the bank would sign this amount of money and issue it to you, right? And then, in order to pay to a vendor, what you do was to send that signature to that vendor as a proof that you have that amount of money. And later on, that vendor would deposit that signature with the bank. However, if we use this very simple design, we lose our privacy. And the reason is that the bank both issued as a signature, right? We give the signature to the vendor, and then the vendor gives it to the bank. So the bank knows that this signature comes from this vendor, and therefore knows what we have done to spend that money, what we have purchased, etc. right? So we need to improve that very basic design with a few privacy properties. The first property would be to use a blind signature scheme. So instead of just the bank signing an amount of money and then giving us the signature, what we would do was use a blind signature protocol so that the bank doesn't know the signature that was issued to us. There are cryptographic ways of doing this. And later on, when we pay our vendor, instead of just sending the signature, we actually do a process that we could refer to as randomization. So we can randomize our signature before giving it to the vendor. And then when the vendor deposits the signature with the bank cannot recognize it because, first of all, he didn't know the signature, and later on, we have randomized the signature, so the vendor doesn't know the signature where it comes from either, right? So this way we can protect the privacy of the user. Then, as digital money, we have the problem also that it is very easy to copy. It's not like physical cash where there are several measures that prevent counterfeiting, right? So digital money is very easy to copy, and we also need a mechanism that prevents a malicious user from sending the same signature, randomizing it and sending it to different vendors and paying for several items, right? So in order to solve that problem, we need a mechanism for double spending detection. What we do basically is to sign, along with the amount of money, a unique serial number. For each signature, there is a unique serial number that is signed. Then, once the user has the signature, he will again randomize and show the signature and reveal this serial number to the vendor so that the vendor can check with the bank whether this serial number has already been spent or not. And if it hasn't been spent, then the vendor is able to deposit it. If it has been spent, then there is a double spending detection going on and the payment is not accepted. Now, as we can see now, this description only allows us for online payments because what we have is that the vendor needs to online, during the payment, check with the bank that the coin hasn't been spent. Now, it's very convenient to have also offline payments because in many situations, for example, vending machines or shops that are not connected to a network, they cannot actively check with the bank that a coin has already been spent. So in order to enable offline payments, what we do is to enable double spending identification. So instead of having the bank actively check whether there has been a double spending detection by checking the serial number of the signature before the vendor can accept the payment, what we do is to provide an algorithm that allows the bank to compare this payment with all previous payments, and if there was only double spending, then the bank can retrieve the identity or the public key of the user who produced that double spending. But that is only done, that can only be done, this de-anonymization can only be achieved if there is a double spending. Otherwise, the privacy of the user is protected. So in NIM, we have been developing offline anonymous e-cash schemes that actually can protect the privacy of the user and still enable offline payments. Another issue we have in the case of offline payments is that you need to be able to pay the exact amount. And the reason is that the vendor that receives, it is not possible to give change because the vendor that receives a payment and deposits it with the bank is not anonymous towards the bank because the bank needs to deposit that payment with the account of the vendor. So if the user doesn't have the exact amount of money to pay the bank, to pay the vendor, then he wouldn't be able to receive change. So for this reason, to solve this paying the exact amount problem, normally we resort to having coins of the smallest possible denomination and pay as many coins as necessary. And all our research focuses on reducing the improving the efficiency of the payment process so that paying a coin is very efficient, and then you don't have you have very efficient payments while still allowing offline payments. So what, in conclusion, I can say is that currently it is possible to have digital cash that mirrors the privacy properties in terms of anonymity that physical cash gives us.
Thank you so much. So we do have the cryptographic tools for something like eCash. And it's something that I think, like, if we can get into the CBDC talk a little bit more to the final part of the panel, when the debates around CBDCs are quite kind of contentious, so a lot of people freak out exactly about the privacy question when it comes to CBDCs, because when it comes to privacy, you know, the idea that a state holds, you know, all transaction data and can surveil everybody and can, you know, I don't know, shut down the transactions of dissidents or this, that, and whatever is quite a scary thought for a lot of people. You know, the kind of authoritarian implications is quite a scary thought. But I think we should maybe look into a little bit the digital euro as it's actually designed in terms of the technical requirements that actually were published a little bit earlier this year. I know that you've looked into that a little bit, Alfredo, if you have a few comments on that. And then maybe we can hear from Andres and Brett to wrap up.
Yeah, so I invite everybody here. I don't know if you are aware of this proposal that has been released in January this year for a digital euro. I invite everybody to read that document and share their thoughts on it and with the European body that is developing it. So it's very interesting in the sense that some parts of the document are quite detailed in terms of the infrastructure that needs to be developed or the components that the digital euro should have, while other parts regarding how things should be done or what exactly should its component do to achieve the goals that are in the document are not described really. So, I mean, this is a market research proposal, and it still needs work in order to actually develop a good proposal that is concrete for the design of the digital euro. What I can say is that the document cares about privacy in the sense that there is a ledger on top that would be managed by the European Central Bank, and this ledger is not able to find out how you spend your money. But this is done by, in the middle, having intermediaries between users and that ledger managed by the European Central Bank. And those intermediaries, which actually have the tasks of onboarding users and providing them with the software, the wallets, etc., that is needed, those intermediaries actually can learn information, and they are also responsible of enforcing several laws like anti-money laundering, etc. So it's not that the proposal totally aims at protecting privacy of the users as a whole against everybody. There are these intermediaries that can learn some information. However, in terms of the functional requirements that are given in the proposal, they mirror quite a lot what one would expect an anonymous eCash scheme like the one I have just described gives us. So actually, I think anonymous eCash would be a very good scheme to implement the digital euro.
Yeah, and I think I was looking at some numbers earlier, and it does look like about half of the central banks that are looking at CBDCs at the moment are quite keen on something like an offline eCash type design. Andres, do you want to talk a little bit about, if we go back to some of the early thinking around CBDCs, like what were they actually for? What is their original intention? And maybe also some thoughts on anonymous eCash from your perspective.
Right, so I'll start with the second point, and so as to remember that this is not hypothetical. In Canada, barely 2 years ago, we had the government of Canada decree an emergency to literally shut down the accounts and the crowdfunding of the truckers movement that was opposing vaccines. They, at that moment, claimed that it was, Russian money or whatever, and then in the eventual audit that the Canadian Parliament did, there was nothing of the sort. But they already made the scandal and justified the measure when it was fairly sort of organic. And it really makes you think whether, you know, I don't like that you're protesting, so I shut you down from the financial system is not hypothetical. It happened 2 years ago, not in some authoritarian country of the global south, but in Canada, a privacy-preserving and human rights respecting powerful country. So you really have to think about, you know, okay, so how should we act now if we want to crowdfund something, you know, crowdfund a protest? Because, you know, crypto is not a full alternative either, because now you have the stuff on the chain and it can be easily monitored, and that's what the Canadian government did as well. So we really need to build infrastructure and technology itself so that it's resilient, privacy preserving, human rights respecting, and democracy building. Protests are part of democracy. And in terms of the design of the original CBDCs, the first CBDCs were actually thought of in the global south, not in the north. Because in the north, there are very few people that don't have bank accounts, and they have been sort of intertwined with the banking system. But in the global south, it was actually from a financial inclusion perspective, right? So you have many, many people and many, many transactions that are not done via the electronic payment systems, but actually on a bilateral physical basis. And of course, as Google and Boston Consulting Group called it in the case of India, it was a 600 billion pot of gold that was left untapped, because all that could be, you know, extracted in terms of not just information, but liquidity that could be multiplied through the banking system. So the central banks of developing countries in the global south started to think about, okay, if we want to do a quick financial inclusion from a monetary perspective, not necessarily a business perspective, maybe what we need is, you know, central banks to, you know, get on this and try to do something like this. And we've had several initiatives in Africa, in South America. In the case of my country, Ecuador, we were the first modern age CBDC that experimented with this. And of course, our first CBDC was not privacy preserving. We had a ledger at the Central Bank of Ecuador with no intermediaries in the process. And in theory, the central bank could see the entire movement of money that would happen in the ledger. But you had total inclusion, because all you had to do was have a national ID number and you automatically had an account at the central bank. Now, why that I still think was important. The fact that there were no intermediaries in the middle gave the people the opportunity to make the central bank accountable to society. And that's why I still think that CBDCs are a good idea, not in a tiered version, not in a version where the private players take over the functioning of the system, but in a system where the people can have a direct relationship with the central bank. Because then they start to question the logic of money. They'll try to understand, what is this information all about? Where is all this data going? Where is all this information flowing? Oh, okay, so it's in a ledger at the central bank. Okay, then let's make it privacy enhanced. You know, let's put zero knowledge technology in there, zero knowledge proof technology in there, and so on. And it will create a conversation between an institution that usually in every country in the world, but especially in Europe, the central bank is out of touch with the common folks. So I think it will build an opportunity for the democratization of money, including the component of the human right to privacy.
Fantastic. Brett, last comments. Do you want to give a kind of overview? Because I'm actually very keen for, you know, the digital euro to become part of the conversation at CPDP. I think it's like quite an important conversation. We're talking about core infrastructure of society that's like really, you know, the digitization process is sped up massively and it has huge implications. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of I've heard you speak before about how the conversation around CBDCs has kind of evolved from the early days until now and where we're at right now.
Sure. Well, maybe this follows on from Andres's points, because there's different political visions that you can kind of project into CBDC. In my first question, I mentioned this, the layers of money in our society. We essentially have 3 layers, I would say, right? So you can choose to use physical cash issued by governments, or in the case of the euro, like a kind of meta government. You can choose to use digital casino chips issued by the banking sector, all right, like Commerce Bank, for example. Or you could use digital casino chips, or like third layer casino chips issued by players like PayPal, all right, or like stable coins. Those are a third layer thing built on top of the banking sector, which is built on top of the central banking layer. Now, one of the big politics about layer 2, the commercial bank layer, is that the commercial banks have the ability to issue out far more of these second layer digital casino chips than they have in reserves, all right? So they create money through the process of issuing loans, all right? Now, and so a large part of the money supply actually takes the form of commercial bank issued digital casino chips. Now, historically, monetary reform movements who are concerned about the power of the banking sector were concerned by that, right? Because basically what the banking sector has the power to mobilize or shut down particular industries in society. So the banking sector's choices about which industries to support gives them huge amounts of political power. And if you're a monetary reform movement and you want to reduce the power of the banking sector, that's a power you might want to take away from them. All right? But politically, that's largely impossible in many capitalist countries because the banking sector often has huge political power. So monetary reform groups, for example, in the UK back in 2015, started thinking about, could we use a form of so-called digital cash to weaken the banking sector? This would be another way of saying, could we give ordinary citizens access to the central bank? All right? Because right now, only the commercial banks have access to the central bank, where they use what's called reserves, which is a digital form of state-issued money. But imagine if we gave everybody access to the central bank, it would cut into the realm of the commercial banking sector. So the original version of CBDCs, or the original proposals, at least in the Western world, and I'm taking into account, of course, that this is a kind of European-focused position I'm giving here, was partially about, can we weaken the banking sector? All right. Now, bear in mind, most central banks don't want to weaken the banking sector because they're often acting to try and protect financial stability and protect the banking sector often. So the version of CBDC that we're looking at right now actually started to come out during the pandemic when the central banks twigged that there was a massive financial stability problem if that layer 1 physical cash was undermined, right? You'd have huge problems of public confidence in the banking sector, which is why one of the big things I always talk about right now is I think the digital euro strapline is like an anchor for the digital age, all right? Any central banker knows this about the anchoring role of central bank money. It anchors the commercial bank money, right? So they're now thinking about, okay, can we make this anchor? But the problem that they're stuck in now is that if they do that, they kind of go into that zone of the monetary reformers, which is like, well, actually, we'll start to potentially compete with the banking sector through this digital form of money. Historically, this didn't occur because physical cash didn't really compete with bank-issued digital money. All right. So what they're going to be doing right now in all the discussions, the banking sector is lobbying the hell out of the ECB and all the central banks to try and weaken the CBDC proposals, to kind of water them down, to make them friendly to the banking sector, which is why they're going to be having all these intermediaries, for example, coming into the process to essentially scrape data and fees and so on and try to minimize the impact of the CBDC on the central banks. Maybe the last thing I'll say about this is that in the sort of popular discourse right now, this is all intersecting with the rise of the populist right, which is a whole kind of much bigger topic. And many people in the populist right have become sort of very agitated by this intersection between the two kind of core pillars of many sort of mainstream conversations right now, which is the so-called digital transition and the green transition, all right? So the digital transition basically emerges from bog standard capitalist processes where corporations want to automate everything, all right? So digitization is all about automation. It's about how do you speed up, accelerate the processes of an economic system. The green transition, by contrast, is how you slow things down. And that comes from a totally different source. It comes from decades of lobbying by climate change campaigners, right? And now we find in mainstream institutions these two agendas, which often don't work together, sort of put together. All right, and what's been happening on the populist right is they're starting to basically make out that, for example, the CBDC will be used to force you to buy, you know, the proverbial vegan sausages, or force you to declare your carbon footprint and so on. So there's a whole kind of public narrative emerging about CBDC being an instrument of kind of woke authoritarian control. Now, this is not really necessarily found in mainstream circles, but it's definitely in my world, when I'm doing cash protection, I'm finding a lot of people who are starting to buy into that populist right version of the anti-cashless society argument. So it's definitely something to be aware of in the political space right now.
Great, thanks very much. I think we're just up against time. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I think to try and kind of synthesize for a second, I hope that that gave a little bit of an impression of like what's actually at stake in this big change from physical modes of payment to digital modes of payment, and what that means in terms of data and who has control over the data, and the implications for privacy. Just to kind of note that, you know, when we're talking about payments, we're talking about our everyday lives, right? We're talking about kind of leaving behind data traces of things that are, you know, everything from our kind of spending habits to our state of mind to our lifestyle. It reveals a lot about a person and about an organization or so on. So there's quite a lot at stake in these transitions and in these debates, and I hope we've brought that to the table in a way that resonates and is meaningful. Should I hand over to? Do we have time for one or two questions, or should we just move? One question? Any burning questions in the audience? Otherwise, I'll pass the mic over. Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much to Nim for the first part of this opening night. Very happy to take over and yeah, just introducing myself. I'm Giancarlo Malgieri. I'm the co-director of the Brussels Privacy Hub and an associate professor of law at Leiden University. We also launched Vulnera last year from this stage at the opening night, and you'll see everything in a goodie bag, so I'm not spending more time on that. Just to say that the Brussels Privacy Hub is very honored to host the second part of the opening night this year. It's a crucial moment for the Hub because one of our co-directors, so my colleague, Professor Chris Kuhner, is going to retire soon. And so a new era is starting for the Brussels Privacy Hub. And CPDP is a turning point, but CPDP is always a turning point. So I'm very honored to introduce our keynote speaker, and there will be a panel afterwards. I will first introduce our keynote speaker, and then I will introduce afterwards the panel for a short discussion before drinks. Professor Julie Cohen, I mean, she doesn't need any introduction. I can just say that for this CPDP 2023, I think the keyword, at least in my mind, was intellectual contaminations. So after 5 years of GDPR, we observed, we analyzed, now we need to act, to react, to contaminate with other fields. And so I will not add anything more. The title is always super interesting. I'm just saying that Julie Cohen is a Mark Cluster Mamulin Professor of Law and Technology at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C., and faculty co-director of the Institute of Technology, Law and Policy. She's author, among many things, of Between Truth and Power and Configuring the Networked Self. Her speech will be about from surveillance vulnerability to donut privacy. If you are curious, just let's hear. You can come here if you want.
Thank you, Gian Claudio, and thank you to all of you for making time on a beautiful May evening to come and listen to this. I was last at CPDP in January 2020, so it is very good to be back here. And the warm-up band was great, so I learned some things about digital currency, so thank you all for that. All right, so here we go. So I'm going to start by introducing two kinds of claims that are made about people's vulnerability to data-driven surveillance and the existential dilemmas that they are thought to pose for privacy and data protection. Neither one should be very new to the crowd in this room, but it's interesting to reflect on them. So one is this predictive claim that particularly now, given the push to AI, there are really no clear stopping points to be defined for data collection and processing, and therefore data-driven surveillance has only one mode, which is expand, right? It is inevitably pushing toward total data surveillance everywhere. The other is this one, which is coming particularly from several communities that I'm going to talk about later. And it's that there is no possibility of ethical surveillance because surveillance has valences, and the valences tend toward racism, colonialism, and other isms that we should not admire and we should not want to support. And if this claim is right, then surveillance is inevitably tainted. And that's a problem for the other predictive claim, which is that surveillance has only the mode of infinite expansion. So let's talk a little about each of these. So the one about no clear stopping point is culturally entangled in a background narrative that links progress, growth, and innovation together in kind of an endless upward spiral. And it traces back to a notion of what growth is and what growth is good for that originates in the discipline of economics, and that links the upward growth curve to human progress. In the modern era, as we have sort of moved full on into the informational age, that narrative about growth has become linked to technological and informational innovation. Innovation fosters productivity, fosters growth, and then, of course, when we move into the information age proper, data mining, and big data and all of the things that are so lovely in that word cloud and AI lead toward growth, which leads toward progress. More is better, and this is entirely simpatico with that claim about no clear stopping points for data collection and processing. The only future in this claim is the singularity that we will presumably achieve at some point as we continue to innovate, grow, and progress. It's all disruption all the time, and if you don't like it, you don't really get a say. Here's the other claim broken out in a bit more detail. Surveillance in the world described by this claim is entangled in a different set of cultural imaginaries that have to do with structural oppression. Data-driven surveillance does the things listed here on this slide. It rationalizes and reproduces problematic aspects of our current geopolitical and condition, embedded biases, carceral dynamics, and racialized and colonialist patterns of power. And if you believe that this claim is true, then this is the direction that is indicated, a movement for surveillance abolition that parallels very explicitly the movement for prison abolition, and calls upon all of us and all of our companies and governments to divest from the surveillance state, from e-carceration. In this vision, the only future is sort of feudal resistance. It's all agency all the time, but not very much disruption to show for it. And usually, you know, your average audience in a data protection setting is well familiar with both of these claims, but there will be some different distributions in terms of who aligns with what. But the interesting thing about them that I want to focus on is that they're not, you know, in this crowd, it shouldn't be a surprise to say that privacy is sometimes important for human and social flourishing. That's what we've all been educated to believe. It's why we are here. It may be somewhat more controversial in some circles to say that surveillance is also sometimes important for human and social flourishing, but I want to say that, and I want to talk about it, and I want to get to why that is in a moment. For me, it has been useful in thinking about these claims and these paradoxes to re-envision what the relationship between privacy and surveillance ought to look like. And now I come to the donut part of the title, which takes inspiration from this diagram, which you may have seen. It comes from a book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. And it's not about privacy, but it is about economics. And it's about the fallacy in that narrative of the continually upward trending growth curve. Raworth points out that it is long past time for everyone, including the discipline of economics and lots of other people, to have learned that continual growth, in fact, doesn't get you human flourishing. It gets you climate disaster, right? And she says it is useful in thinking about what is wrong with the imaginary of continually upward trending growth to re-envision economic growth and economic progress in the shape of a donut. You need enough progress, enough growth, enough data-driven innovation, I'm expanding, to get us all across the minimum social foundation for human flourishing. So you need things like education and housing and food and clean water and the other things that are in the inner ring of this slide. And if you get those things, you get to the safe and just space for humanity, but there's also the outer ring of the donut to contend with, which represents the ecological ceiling. And if you move across the ecological ceiling, you get some other things: climate change, ocean acidification, freshwater withdrawals, ozone layer depletion, etc. It's useful, since the analogy to the claims about the continually upward trending growth associated with data innovation is so stark, it's useful to play out the analogy a bit and ask about what the privacy donut might have to tell us. And I think it has some useful things to tell us. We are all, or many of us anyway, here in this room, familiar with the discussions in academic and policy literatures about the social value of privacy, right? Which is to say that we are used to talking and hearing about the harms that ensue when you move across the surveillance ceiling to the outside of the donut and into the territory of excessive data-driven surveillance. Some of the things on the previous slides, reproduction and entrenchment of biases, colonialist resource extraction, some linkage to ecological disaster, and some other things that were not on previous slides, but that this room should be well familiar with: harms to self-development resulting from excess surveillance and threats to the stability of democratic institutions, and economic sorting, entrenching economic precarity. If I'm right that the donut has something to tell us about the shape of privacy policy as it ought to be, the donut represents the safe and just space for human flourishing. And there's also a tale to be told about what's in the center, right? There are kinds of data collection and data processing that are necessary in order to get us into the space that Raworth so memorably calls the safe and just space for human flourishing, into the donut itself. And if you ask some people what should be in the center of the donut is data processing for security, that's not what I want to talk about. I think it's much more useful to talk about the kinds of data processing that actually do relate directly to human flourishing, data processing for public health, as we've all learned in the last several years, and data processing for some other things like tax enforcement, which gets you the funding for the education and the clean water and all of that, and data processing for anti-corruption and data processing for social benefits provision. If that makes sense to you all, I'll give you just a few more examples of what that looks like. So quite obviously, if one is desirous of combating and preventing the spread of pandemics or epidemics, it is necessary to collect certain kinds of health data and certain kinds of genetic data. Other examples come, as I already noted, from the world of the scam and the world of evasion of social responsibility by the uber wealthy. It is not hard at all to find places where surveillance gaps have resulted in frauds and scams that exploit the powerless, as in the bottom example, a massive misappropriation of pandemic aid from those who really needed it. And it is not hard to find examples involving insufficient revenue, surveillance and collection benefiting especially the wealthiest people in the world at the expense of everyone else. And if you're with me so far, then I think the conclusion has to be that the privacy donut is a metaphor for the necessary shape of governance power to get us into that safe and just space for human flourishing and keep us in the safe and just space for human flourishing, and out of the territory of either insufficient social support, the hole in the center of the donut, or excess surveillance vulnerability once we cross the donut's outer boundary. Now, that's all very well and good. And we have the GDPR, at least if we're European, which I'm obviously not, so everything should be great. But I want to talk about one more thing before I finish. I want to talk about what happens to that framework and what happens to to surveillance power when surveillance power moves into the information infrastructure. And the claim that I want to make to you is that infrastructuralized surveillance power embeds that logic of continual extraction, and it embeds it by way of kind of a dispersal of accountability. So what am I talking about? So first, I'm talking about infrastructure, and it's useful to think of infrastructure in at least these three ways. A demand-side economic definition that talks about downstream productive activities that require a resource to facilitate them, a resource to facilitate human activity across scales. The second definition comes from science and technology studies, and it talks about what the infrastructural resource looks like in practice, how it works. It works to mediate tensions across scales, but it works by becoming embedded, transparent to use, taken for granted. The infrastructural resource becomes visible upon breakdown, but when it's working well, we don't notice it. Think about the electricity in your home, or everything about the internet that we, even at a privacy conference, take for granted. And then the third formulation comes from cultural studies and talks about infrastructure as a technique of governance. It's a technique of governance because infrastructure doesn't just facilitate the things we do, it also configures and shapes and constrains what we do. How does this apply to the privacy donut and to the outer surveillance frontier? Think now about infrastructures for data collection, harvesting, patterning, and all of the kinds of data-driven progress that lurk in the background of those claims about continual expansion and moral taint. So we've got on our hands now embedded digital architectures that perform a dispersed modular intermediation of all of one's digital interactions for data-driven surplus extraction. It's not simply that we have infrastructures for digital exchange or for digital data-driven exchange, but these infrastructures are constructed in particular ways, kind of revolving around the developer kits and API modules that get pushed out from dominant platform ecosystems to sites and apps that make up the modern digital environment. And the infrastructuralization of these sort of modular architectures for data collection is the thing that causes them to become submerged, right? To become transparent to use and visible only on breakdown. And it enables a lot of the activity that takes us across the outer boundary of that surveillance donut, that privacy donut, the regulatory workarounds, for example, these gig workers aren't my employees, they're just licensees of my information service, and it's all enabled by modular architectures for data-driven surplus extraction. And the architecture also enables a certain amount of functional disaggregation. You may be familiar with the proceedings recently before the Belgian DPA that had to do with claims that a data controller could not be located, right? Because the nature of the data harvesting architecture was so dispersed that there was no single place to locate functional responsibility for the things that the infrastructure was doing. When we get to the stage of infrastructuralized surveillance power, the power becomes embedded in shared standards in a way that renders it much more difficult to call to account. It's not simply that it's not explainable, although it often is not. It's really transparent to critique because it is taken for granted and becomes the ordinary way of doing everything. And the infrastructuralized surveillance power scales up and out in ways that effectuate redistributions of power and vulnerability, rendering the rendering the resulting arrangements much more likely to kind of push across the outer boundary of that privacy donut into the territory of unsustainability and out of the safe and just space for human flourishing. Now, a thing I want to say to you about infrastructural surveillance power is that most of what is in the GDPR's toolkit is not very effective at the infrastructural level. Okay, I've already mentioned that it can be very difficult simply to identify a controller, right, for some of this infrastructuralized data harvesting and data processing. But more specifically, I want to just mention two major strands of the GDPR's toolkit, one having to do with individual control rights. We're going to hear a lot at this conference about lovely things like the design of privacy icons and regulation of dark patterns. But when a mechanism of data collection and exchange moves into the infrastructure and becomes surveillance infrastructure, it is sort of wildly unlikely to be constrained by individual assertions of rights. Infrastructuralized surveillance power normalizes underlying conditions of data processing and exchange. And therefore, the rights to consent that get offered sort of at the top, at the surface of the infrastructure are much more likely to legitimate everything that's going on underneath it. We're going to talk about dark patterns rather than about all the software developer kits that are in all the apps on your phone, pulling all the data trails and sending them back to the ecosystem operators that, that gave the developer kits to the app developers in the first place. The other thing that's worth noting is that managerial controls don't seem to be much more effective. There is an impressive compliance culture organized around data protection. I know that there are people here who probably work in compliance. But a lot of the managerial assessment and risk management and risk mitigation process in practice seems not to contend with underlying logics of surveillance, and in particular seems not to contend very effectively with the moral claim that I presented to you at the outset, the claim that surveillance is always morally tainted because it always works to normalize and entrench racialized, colonialist, and extractive logics and power imbalances. I think that's not all that's in the GDPR's toolkit, and we haven't talked about the general principles that are supposed to be satisfied anytime data are collected or processed. But I just want to. So with regard to those principles, and this is the last slide, I just want to leave you with some thoughts about how to maybe sharpen up those principles so that they reinforce more effectively the safe and just space for human flourishing in respect of surveillance and privacy. It's true that within the regime of the GDPR, the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation are supposed to be always satisfied. And yet, it also seems to be true that it's very hard to do that when surveillance power becomes infrastructuralized, right, and dispersed by means of developer kits and constant embedded instrumentalities for collecting and transmitting data. And so there's a question about how to give those principles more teeth. And it seems to me that you can say all you want, but at least part of the answer has to involve design to just stop data in its tracks, right? And in particular, to keep data within the sectors for which it was initially initially collected. If you think back to that, to Raworth's ecology donut, part of the problem that seems always to end up threatening to move us out of the safe and just space for human flourishing and across the frontier into ecological disaster involves the ways that ecological and environmental damage have synergistic effects, the ways they reinforce one another, and the ways they can get us to tipping points. It seems that people who do AI research ought to think about that more, and of course some of them are, but I'm not seeing it in, for example, the risk pyramid in the EU AI Act. The fairness principle, it seems to me, is likely to legitimate certain background distributive arrangements to which the movement for surveillance abolition rightly objects. To normalize, for example, the kinds of intrusive profiling for creditworthiness or employability, rather than challenging them and subjecting them to anti-subordination and equity mandates. And I think that's something that needs a lot more scrutiny. You see it a bit in the proposed platform work regulation or directive, I forget which it is, but not enough. And of course, there's privacy by design, which I'm sort of still waiting to understand. I think the challenge for privacy by design is going to be not to take the existing infrastructuralization of surveillance power for granted. And the worry is that it will do exactly that. It is important, in particular, to do more than give people explanations and rights to consent. It is important to allow them to intervene at the outset and repeatedly. Okay. I think I'm going to stop, and we'll transition into the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for such a wonderful presentation, linking fields that apparently are very far away, like from incarceration to sustainable economy. But actually, I think you drove us through, from the myth of progress to governance power to the fallacy of GDPR. And in this moment, the EDPS is organizing the birthday of GDPR somewhere else. And here we are more for the critical part, maybe, just to create the tensions that are undeserved. Actually, yeah, I'm so proud to now open the discussion with this incredibly diverse and high-level panel. Just to say, I wanted just to, as a bridge, it's impossible to consider all these topics in micro-silos, and that's why we have so different and diverse expertise at this table. So I'm very happy to introduce Alexandra Gies. She is a member of parliament for Germany since 2019. She's the vice president of the Greens and European Free Alliance Group. It's interesting that we went from sustainable economy, and so the Greens are at the table, but actually she was the shadow rapporteur for the Digital Services Act, and the Green Coordinator for the Special Committee on the AI Act, Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age Special Committee. Then we have François Pellegrini. He's Vice President at CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, where he's Commissioner since 2014, in charge of sectors of e-commerce, cybersecurity, sovereign file, and European coordination, but he's also Professor of Informatics. So we have also two computer scientists at this table to enrich the discussion. He's Professor of Informatics at the University of Bordeaux and researcher at Labri and INRIA Bordeaux. And then we have Timo Jacobi. He's Professor for AI-based user experience evaluation at the Nuremberg University of Applied Sciences in Germany, with a background in human-computer interaction and connecting human-computer interaction to data protection law. But let's start from Alexandra. You were at the very center of the whole EU policy making about post-GDPR digital strategy in Europe. So I'm curious to hear your comments on what Julie said about GDPR and where are we now? After 5 years, we are regulating platforms. So the DSA was, I think, a success. But was it a failure of GDPR? Could we do more? So it's up to you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you especially, Julie. It was really a pleasure listening to you, because I had the feeling you gave me the academic background for some political points I have been making throughout the discussions we have had working on the DSA, on GDPR enforcement, the DMA as well. And I think there are some points that I would like to outline here. I think the first one is this GDPR is the idea, the vision behind GDPR is individuals protecting their privacy against a state actor, basically. That's a philosophical idea behind it. It's really very liberal idea. And what is not really considered is the societal impact of privacy. And in the meantime, in the past year, seeing what the platforms are doing, the development of artificial intelligence, hate speech, disinformation epidemic, what we are seeing is that we're trying to use privacy as a tool to counter that societal impact. And that is so interesting about taking Kate Raworth's theory of the donut, because there you put the societal impact at the center, and not the individual's right. So what we're trying to do in Europe is to use GDPR as an instrument against all those societal harms, but I think this is not what GDPR was designed to do. So putting societal harms and societal impact in the center is very important here. That links to the fact that there's a total asymmetry between the decision that we can make as individuals, which who work on, especially on social networks, on platforms, is basically whether to click yes on a cookie banner or I want to see all the other options and then get lost in the internet. We are giving individuals a responsibility which they cannot live up to. They cannot absolutely live up to that, to protect society from all the harms that go with giving your data to those companies or that surveillance infrastructure. You know, who knows that whoever uploads a picture on Facebook, I mean, people in the room know, but the public out there doesn't, that pictures might be used to train artificial intelligence to persecute the Uyghurs in China. That's not the kind of responsibility you can give to an individual, certainly not in the current situation where you basically don't have alternatives to saying yes to a cookie banner. But not even if we modify and improve those features. And I have worked a lot on the dark patterns article in the DSA and lived through the frustration then seeing the Commission put in the other article that says, well, it just applies if GDPR doesn't apply. This was really a fight, and I know how difficult it is even to do that. But even if we did it, it's still too much responsibility. There's a huge asymmetry between individuals making choices and the impact those choices have on society, which the individual cannot know in that moment. And you know, we cannot expect people who work 8 to 10 hours a day, raise their children, have other problems in life to be totally informed about what surveillance infrastructure means and why you have to say no to that cookie banner, even if you had the option to say no. So I think this asymmetry is really important. And then the third issue is power. Yeah, we are talking about a handful of companies in the Western world which control this surveillance infrastructure, or at least who reap the fruit from it, and which are the same who reap the fruit and get the revenue from artificial intelligence. And that is also something we cannot just face with GDPR. And therefore, I really liked that idea of expliciting the surveillance infrastructure and maybe having something like GDPR plus or privacy for society against surveillance infrastructure, which does not rely on GDPR, keeping GDPR intact, obviously, but having something that is the answer of democratic societies to surveillance infrastructure, which relies on the power of the state, of the government, of parliaments, of democracy, rather than on individuals' choices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a great element in this table is dark patterns. I'm very happy that we have Francois Pellegrini, because he's not only a computer scientist and a scholar, but he's also the vice president of one of the most proactive and important data protection authorities in the world. And I'm curious about this because you conducted great research sorry, this was the timer for, because you conducted great research on dark patterns and how computer science can enrich the enforcement for the GDPR. And after 5 years of enforcement, what can you tell us?
This one's working better, thank you. Well, first, thank you very much for the talk, and just a small hint about the fact of the GDPR or other data protection laws having more teeth. But it usually works better when regulators have bigger sticks and means for investigation as well. So this goes to the answer to your question. Clearly, in fact, when you are, I would say, when your attention as a regulator is drawn to a specific case, you have to make a case, I mean, in terms of investigation, and then eventually go to the sanction process with the findings that you have, I would say, unearthed. And so the question is, at some point, there will be a debate between the fact that some actions are legitimate or not. And this is indeed a big subject about the cookie banners, as you have mentioned as well. I think it's interesting to see the shift in the handling of these bits of data, even for the legal basis regarding the GDPR. There have been really interesting news this week, and one of them was that the AAB modified the TCF and now is kicking out the legitimate interest out of the TCF. And I think this is really important because many players were pretending to use the legal basis of legitimate interest to run data collections that were at a global scale, because they were sharing, all this network of brokers were sharing information. So that could be as well an infrastructure, because they had the means of interconnecting all these silos and check and cross-check and cross-check all the information. So this news is interesting in that respect, because it shows that indeed the regulators together, because it's part of the work of the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, to go to building a doctrine in which, through guidelines and then through court cases, we will shape I would say, the economy, and try to put some players that abuse of their technological powers back in line and into the rule of law. And so regarding dark patterns, there is clearly an interesting debate, even recently at the EDPB, with all the data protection authorities, about the fact that, okay, is the fact of having someone to go to a second layer to express a rejection legitimate or not? And indeed, at CNIL, we made experiments, so it's not per se informatics experiments. It's, I mean, practical experiments with real people. I mean, we took people as data subjects and subjects of studies to check whether by changing the interface, there would be a modification in the rate of acceptance of the cookies or the tracers or whatever. And indeed there are. So these are facts that are useful to us as regulators to show that in order to protect people better, there should be rules that have to be implemented regarding the fact that the rejection button should be at the first layer at the same place as the accept all button that you can see blinking and smiling to you in any way. So I think it's very important to take into account, you were speaking about vulnerabilities, the fact that many people, as you said, are not experts, and both the lawmaker and the regulator which implements the law. So everything goes up to the lawmaker, but all these players provide information that are key to useful enforcement. And I think it's important also as a regulator, because we have much work. People complain that we don't do enough, but we have only limited powers, and we have at some point to select the cases. But it's important to have all these networks of players, the experts that will draw the attention of the regulator and the lawmaker. Even the possibility of class action, it's something that has been discussed also for quite a long time, and which is going to show up. All these means are ways to address the fact that the law is here to protect the weak against the strong. And so just about the dark patterns, CNIL has produced some publications. We have what we call a cahier innovation et prospective. So I can just advise you to go to the CNIL website and find some literature in English about our findings on these issues of dark patterns.
Thank you so much. This is such an important topic. As you know, we have this platform called Vulnera, and this is very much in line with what the CNIL is doing. I would like to go to follow up with Timo Jacobi. You were a bit a pioneer in bringing together, like in connecting a human-computer interface with data protection topics, and also not just in the field of dark patterns, but also in the field of injuries and harms, and we were discussing about consent. So what do you think of all this discussion, and from your perspective, which is a very interdisciplinary one?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, of course, for being here. And first, I want to say sorry on behalf of all human-computer interaction, or would be, in the industry, it would be more like user experience design, which is my field, which is maybe 90% responsible for all dark patterns around. I chose to go the other way to try and actually work with DPAs, haven't worked with CNIL yet, to come up with studies, experiments with real users to understand how interaction online works. And I'm so grateful that you brought up the infrastructure idea, because infrastructures, yes, that's very much what guides our everyday actions online, right? I was immediately thinking of the single sign-on. Who wouldn't use single sign-on? It's so easy, right? And user experience designers did a great job making it easy for you. And they keep doing that. And yeah, to an extent where actually dark patterns emerge in the most different interactions with online companies, not only on cookie banners, most famously, arguably, with cookie banners, but also designing your data subject right processes, for example. Let's say, companies not necessarily have the biggest interest of you finding your way to making your subject access rights claim, let's say. I think we're not only in a situation where we have infrastructures that work against users online. We also lack infrastructures for helping users to counter these effects, actually. So, for example, relying on consent every time on a cookie banner is something that ticks the box for informed consent, but is it actually an informed consent? Arguably, no. What we have instead is a long tradition of agents in HCI research, which can help you bring across, let's say, your will in an automated way, such that you wouldn't be hassled with cookie banners anymore, yet have a good sense of privacy settings made for you online. So what I think we have to come towards is infrastructures that also work for citizens and for online users. Because right now, everything works against you as a user online. Millions, billions of dollars work every day to get your data. And there's not a lot that works for you except DPAs giving their best and maybe some researchers. But I think what we have to do is really team up as closely as possible to make any kind of impact on the political sphere. Yes, because otherwise there's too much up against us.
Yeah, Julie, your speech was very fruitful in inspiring this debate. What do you think? How do you react? Because I think now the discussion was very much on dark patterns, GDPR, etc. What's your view on that?
Well, so I don't think I heard a lot of agreement, right? Not so much of a debate, right? I think it's so, okay, so I want to say something about, I'm actually not really interested in talking about dark patterns. I kind of took that to be one of the purposes of what you just said. We gravitate toward the things on the top layer that we can see. I want to say something about the DSA and the DMA also, and I'm interested to hear what Alexandra thinks. They're in some ways quite bold and in other ways quite traditional, right? So you have, they augment what we have in the GDPR, which as you said is very individual focused, with a lot more individual focused stuff, particularly in the DSA, right? Disclosures, right? So disclosures about recommenders, disclosures about ad placement. But what you never get is disclosures about single sign-on, right? Disclosures about all the little modules that have been pushed out to all the developers that create the distributed, disaggregated architecture for data collection that is powering the whole system. And if you don't get that, you're only getting the tip of the iceberg, right? Because all of these pieces work in concert together with the recommender algorithms, and so it's very, very hard to kind of get meaningful purchase. The DMA I was super optimistic about, and then I read it, right? And it's about processing, but it kind of leaves collection to the GDPR, right? So there's this big hole in the DMA that goes back to all of the ways that the GDPR supposedly regulates collection, but really doesn't. And it doesn't, and so a lot about cross-combining, right, and self-preferencing and all of that, but not so much, again, about these underlying infrastructures that are so, so, so important. And it's, and yet, it's really hard to stop talking about the things that we are so comfortable talking about, right? The cookie banners and the dark patterns and the this and the that. The commission has to stand up a whole new competency, right? Or two, just to enforce the DMA and the DSA. And I am saying they need something else, right? So I'm interested to hear if Alexandra, if that kind of jibes with your understanding.
Alexandra.
Yes, it totally does. I totally agree. I think what we need to see is that the DSA. I know it's difficult to explain because it's legislation now. It's an act. It's done, and you imagine people setting out to write a law that they really think and they dive into the topic and then they put their ideas and then they find the compromises and then it's done. That's not exactly how it works. First of all. Digital platforms have a level of complexity that is really difficult to handle for policymakers. I have to say this very honestly. I mean, I really took a deep dive in digital and how digital advertising works, and I started to understand, and it's complicated enough. But I think on all the developers modules, I still have a lot to learn. And I think in the European Parliament, I'm one of the policymakers who really took that time to dive into this. So most people don't understand the whole complexity, and this is really an issue. And this is, I think, why many of us stay at the surface, because you try to start working on something you really understand and are able to explain, because try to explain what happens hinter the facade of the internet to your voters to get reelected, you fail miserably. And that's one of the structural problems of policymaking, that we are not really ready to address this level of complexity, where the companies obviously do their best with enormous lobbying efforts to hide all that complexity and try to make you to talk about one specific thing, which when we started on the DSA, and here come to the good side and how it improved over time. When I started working on the DSA, before it was even out, it was all about content moderation. You remember the discussion in the US? It was all Section 230, and in Europe, it was all about content moderation. Everybody who had ever worked on this regulation of digital platforms was content moderation. And this is exactly what the platforms wanted us to talk about. And I think what happened during the DSA, when people really started working on it, I think in the Commission there were some people who really took a deep dive and really understand platforms very, very deeply. Awareness changed. And it really changed a lot. And there was this big movement on the ban for data-driven advertising or surveillance advertising that really made a lot of noise in Brussels. And that was basically us in Parliament and the NGOs working on this. And when we started out on the DSA, that was a non-topic. You know, I always thought, well, what are you talking about? This is not in the DSA. It was not in the Commission proposal. Nobody ever discussed it. And we did get the ban on using sensitive data, the ban on using the data for minors. So if anybody wants to look at how Facebook manages their data, I have some doubts that they can really distinguish sensitive data from non-sensitive data and therefore fulfill the DSA. So I think there has been a process when attention shifted from content moderation, so from individual pieces of content on the internet, which is what the platforms wanted us to talk about, to the more structural risk, to the business model, to the way the algorithm works. The article on the risk assessment, when it first came out from the Commission, it was all about, how does Meta call that, non-authentic use or something like that. So, you know, there's this malicious actress using the perfectly virtual algorithms of the platforms. And we managed to change that and getting in democracy and public discourse and violence against women and whatever, you know, really a lot of harms. And that was work in process, and who really helped enormously was Frances Hogan, who came out with all that material and spoke to us in Parliament and went to Congress and had all these papers to show, well, Facebook knows about this harms and they're not doing anything about it, well, really on the contrary. So I think during the process of policymaking, there was a shift from individual approaches to a more infrastructural approach. It is totally imperfect, and there I agree. It is really a learning process that has happened, and at a certain point came to an end because you have to finish that piece of legislation at a certain point. My hope is that we can use this as well as the DMA, which will give a lot of insight on how the gatekeepers work and how the advertising work and so on, that might be a starting point, and the research, the access given to researchers to the data of the platforms, which is really new, some kind of access given to the NGOs, the risk assessments, the independent audits, all that could be a starting point for something more that addresses more the societal harms, the monopolies, the infrastructure, controlling it. But the problem is that is really the power issue. Then you're really up against the big power, and obviously there are some political parties who are ready to face those companies and others who also benefit from having disinformation and hate proliferating in social networks. I mean, that produces a shift to the right in the political panorama. There are parties who are interested in having that, and we are seeing that globally. We're seeing that in Europe. So this is where the power question comes in. So it's a very political answer, but to address you.
Yeah.
It's your job.
I'd have so much to comment on this shift from micro to macro, so from individual to power dynamics. But before opening to one or maybe two questions, I wanted to give the floor to if Francois or Timo wanted to comment on this. Otherwise, we go immediately to the questions.
Just to comment about two things. First, the tremendous difficulty of being a lawmaker in a complex world. So this is true all the more considering the power that you have in front of you, trying to convince you of some, let's say, pre-organized views. Usually when you have the power to influence the law, and you have to be very cautious about that. It's difficult. And one of the examples, the one that you gave, is what I call the digital butler. The fact that if you put a human that gets tired in front of thousands of systems on machines that never get tired and will always ask you for something and ask you for something and ask you for something, at some point you will give up. And clearly the notion of having the digital butler, you know, wait at the door and reply for you is clearly something that gives humans a shield, a protection against this continuous solicitation. And unfortunately, I mean, it was planned in, I think, maybe previous versions of e-privacy, maybe, and was not voted for. So at some point, you know, in the balance of powers, there was a pressure against protecting people and leaving them naked in front of the assault of all these computerized systems. And clearly thinking in terms of protecting the people, well, of course, I'm a TPA, is important and really not at the individual level, because all these individuals make a society. And I mean, I told you about these kind of, I would say, perpetual solicitations and I would say requests from machines. And as you mentioned, in the information sphere, the fact that we have continuous access to information is a civilizational risk, because our brains are built on top of, I would say, Pavlovian processes, which means that repetition means truth. And clearly, as humans that are all built on the same physiological principles, how can we fight back against the fact of being completely, I would say, bombarded by all this information that repeats itself all the more when the information is filtered in order for you to react and act in a predefined way. So I think here it's very important that we have these legislations which in fact carry out not even a view on the markets. It's called the digital markets, but the real I would say the meaning of these legislations is to shape a view of society in which indeed there is some regulation for the players that are capable of influencing the society as a whole, and I think as a whole. Sorry, and I think it's really important to understand that indeed we should shift from a market-oriented legislation to a civilization protection legal system. And it was also, I mean, even if you consider the GDPR, it's already the same. I mean, we protect individual rights, but we also protect some values of a higher level regarding the fact that people can exercise their right to privacy up to some point, as has been described.
Yeah, and there's also impact assessment, which is all the other part of the story. You want to add something?
I think I'd be interested in questions.
Yeah. So I think Bianca granted us time for 2 questions, right? So if there are, otherwise I'm sure we can go on for another few minutes. So I see Jeff and Lexo. So is there a way to maybe...
Hello?
Which one? There.
Thank you for a great panel. I have a comment and a question. First of all, my comment, I find it a bit worrisome that I see the same narrative reiterated that has been pushed down by industry mainly of the GDPR is mainly about individual rights, individual control. It seems like we're all, like, as this community has been gaslit by industry with this convenient narrative that, you know, it's just about individual control and it's all up to the individuals. Whereas indeed, as you alluded to at the end of the panel, indeed there's plenty other protections like impact assessments, like the data quality principles, you know, accuracy, security, purpose limitation, data minimization, data transfers, you know, all these limitations. To me, it seems more that the issue is not, the issue is more that we're relying too much now on individuals to enforce and to go to court, etc., and that we're not seeing enough enforcement. Luckily, there's some positive change, but it's more about enforcement of these more protective measures and too much buying into that narrative of, oh, it's just about the individual. If only we can get that consent problem correct. But as to my question, and inspired by Julie's presentation, it seems very much that, or at least reading between the lines in your talk, the law itself is a problem, no? can we find solutions in just the law to the issues that you frame? It's interesting, we have a legislator in the panel, we have an enforcer on the panel. What other routes do you see for positive change in this regard outside of the law, or maybe despite the law? Thank you.
While the mic goes to the other question, maybe Julie, you want to react?
So I think that I wouldn't count the law out, but before the law can be very effective, it's necessary to see the problem properly. And there are, when something becomes infrastructure, it submerges itself, right? And in the particular case we're discussing, the capabilities we're discussing have been constructed to be submerged, right? To operate beneath the radar. And it is really, really important to open them up, right? Now, so if, and you're right? There are these pieces in the GDPR that are underutilized, I would say, right? That could perhaps be used to do that, right? There is the risk assessment, the very large platform stuff in the DSA that could be used to do that. And so the, part of the challenge is to actually use the tools that are there. I am not super convinced we have all of them because I think that what happens, again, is it's easier to kind of look up at what you're used to looking at, and there are finite resources in the world. And so there's a question of how to prioritize enforcement resources and investigation resources to kind of drill down to the root of the problem. And I think that's going to be very important.
Yeah, one idea what else could be the answer, even if I'm the policymaker, so I'm supposed to make the laws. Economic theory around antitrust and competition, I think, needs to evolve a lot, because it's still very much based on the idea, as long as there's no harm for consumers that can be documented and proven somehow, well, they don't really see an issue. And I think there's a lot of potential to further involve, to get to a more modern idea of competition, the link between competition, freedom, democracy, the possibility for all economic actors to have a level playing field. I think this is particularly relevant. So I think economic theory, economic policy would have an important role here. Because we really lack a little bit the theory, the economic theory, to bolster up what we might do in legislation in terms of antitrust. To just come back to your criticism, I'm not trying to criticize GDPR and the aspects you mentioned, as Julie said, they're underutilized. I'm totally in favor. What I'm experiencing right now, when I ask for more protection against societal harms, the answer I get is consent, according to GDPR. To give you one example, I'm working on the new regulation on transparency and targeting of political advertising. And the whole article on targeting of political advertising, so what data can you use to send out political ads to people, is based on GDPR. And until now, there are discussions of adapting it to the standard we have in DSA. Well, you can't use sensitive data, but the original Commission proposal, the whole Article 12 is based on consent. So if 80% or even, I don't know, I'm not a mathematician, but I don't know how many people you need to be able to have a statistical sample from which you can extrapolate to the whole of society, and you already have a possibility to manipulate. You only need a group that's big enough, even if the majority of people does not give consent, which does not happen because consent will probably one of the lines, and then the TFC, so TCF. There you give a responsibility to an individual to avoid societal harms for democracy, and that doesn't make sense. This is what I'm trying to say about individuals who are given the responsibility to protect society without being able to know about the harms. And that's, I think, is a refusal of democracy to take off governments, of parliaments, to take on that responsibility themselves. This is what I was trying to say.
Thank you. Yeah, just from the enforcer point of view, indeed there are several tools in the GDPR that can be used in order to make a case. But the question when you are on the enforcement side is to have a super strong case, because the first time you try out a new means, even for, you know, let's say usual means that you can put in your files, there will be an appeal. And so if you know there will be an appeal. So even if you understand the things, you have to make sure that the Court of Appeal will also understand the things as you do. Because if it does not happen, that not only it is a blank shot, but it's a shot in your own foot, because you will have lost the opportunity to make a first good impression. You know, the saying, you have only once the opportunity to make a first good impression. So this is why it's quite difficult as an enforcer, when you have some tools, to try them for the first time. And this is what happened if you look at all the case law or the different DPAs, even some of them before the GDPR did not have enforcement powers at all. So it's only 5 years to train the DPAs that did not have the enforcement power before. And there is collaboration between us. We have interns or we exchange personnel to create a global unified views of how to address the case, of how to understand the meaning of the GDPR. Because, of course, some people wrote it, but, you know, I mean, the definition of a camel, it's a horse designed by a commission. So, which means that in the GDPR, you have things that you may interpret in different ways because human languages are ambiguous. So all this takes time. So I can tell you as an enforcer, we would like to try out some means, and for instance, data minimization. That's a cool stuff. Privacy by design. As an informatician, I have a strong view about what can be privacy by design regarding an infrastructure, technical infrastructure of data collection and circulation and zero knowledge proofs and blah, blah, blah. But you have to try that in court. And this is a different piece of cake. So this is why it takes time. I'm sorry. We would like things to be cool and the law to be put in force immediately. But we have to figure out what was written in the law. And Lawrence Lessig says code is law, but I say law is code. That is, you have to read it, to understand it, to patch it when there is a bug because you didn't understand and there is a conflict of norms, which are quite common. So it's a very difficult job. Sorry. So we're doing our best.
30 seconds, Alexo.
30 seconds. Okay, I'll try to be quick. It's one question with two angles, one directed to Alexandra and another to Julie. It's about data-driven advertising. And you mentioned, Alexandra, that sensitive data prohibition somehow you think that will act as a de facto prohibition for Meta's practices, and I just want to or something similar. So I want to ask if that is so, and if you predict that actually like current practices of Meta of the data-driven advertising is going to come to end because of this provision. I'm just remembering 2009, 2010 when the discussions about the GDPR started, and it was one of 3 reasons why GDPR was supposed to come to be, to stop these practices, which have not, nothing have changed actually. But so the second question, and this goes to Julie, is if we would have the ban that the Parliament was trying to get us in the DSA, so ban on data-driven advertising, do you think that the harms coming from the infrastructural level would be dealt with?
Super rapid, Alexandra.
Yeah. Well, super rapid. I think we built in an instrument that the authorities, then the digital services coordinators could use. It's very difficult to predict whether it's going to work. I think we heard about the intricacies and the difficulties of enforcement right before. I think this is extremely difficult to predict, but I think there's hope. I mean, at least that is something that is, flying in your face, staring in your face, basically, for an enforcer to look into. But how this is going to go, it's really difficult to say. I think we have a panel on digital advertising tomorrow morning. I can do some advertising for that one.
So, It depends exactly what the ban would say. Okay, so if you if you want, for example, to get people to buy your book about vaccine conspiracy theories, and you want to advertise your book, you don't actually really need to know that much about people, right? You want to put your ads next to other conspiracy theories, right? And then you want to have, and then there will be a process that involves rapid matching of metadata about the different kinds of content, right? And this, this is, here's one, conspiracy narrative about the climate, and here's another narrative about, public schools teaching the true history, in my case of the United States and its entanglement with slavery, and there's the narrative that says the whole thing is a conspiracy, right? And as a factual matter, it isn't just that people who want to see this stuff only want one conspiracy. There's like a mindset, right? And so in the lingo, I think this is contextual advertising, and it doesn't have to be audience segmentation, right? You place the content next to other content of the same kind, and then you use data about the types of communications to sort of boost visibility in people's feeds. And so a question that I have back for you, I mean, we can do this in cocktails, right? But so if you want to take seriously banning that, it seems that you're going to be writing very complex legislation, right? And I'm fine with that, right? But I just want to be clear on the nature of the problem, and it is not going to be sufficient to say you can't target advertising based on sensitive data. It just is not, especially for the particular kinds of ads that are causing all the political and social perturbations that have got the people in Brussels worried, right? So.
Thank you all, and have a great CPDP. Thank you all.